August 1945. The war was ending, but for thousands of women imprisoned across the Pacific, their darkest hour was just beginning. What the Japanese military called a purification ceremony would become one of the most disturbing and least discussed chapters of World War II. This is the story of the women who survived it. Manila, Philippines, March 1942. Lieutenant Emily Bradford pressed her back against the hospital wall as explosions rocked the building. The Japanese invasion had turned the city into hell on earth. She was 28 years old, an army nurse who had volunteered to serve overseas with dreams of adventure and purpose. Back in Boston, her mother had begged her not to go. Her father, a great war veteran, had looked at her with knowing sadness and said nothing. Now, covered in dust and blood, those dreams seemed like they belonged to someone else entirely. The hospital had been a beautiful colonial building once with high ceilings and wide windows designed to catch the tropical breeze. Now the windows were shattered, the walls pockmarked with bullet holes, and the floors slick with blood. Emily had been working for 36 hours straight, moving from patient to patient in a desperate triage that felt increasingly futile. For every soldier she stabilized, 3 more arrived in worse condition. Captain Margaret Chen grabbed Emily's arm. At 32, Maggie was the senior medical officer and the closest thing to a mother figure the younger nurses had. Her voice cut through the chaos with practiced authority. "We need to evacuate the patients now. The Japanese are 3 blocks away." Emily nodded, her hands shaking as she helped a wounded soldier onto a stretcher. They had maybe 20 minutes before the enemy reached them. The soldier, a kid who could not have been more than 19, grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. His name tag read Morrison. "Don't let them take you," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear and morphine. "I heard what they do to nurses. You gotta get out." Emily felt her throat tighten. She knew the stories too. Everyone did. But there was nowhere to run. The Japanese had surrounded the city days ago, but 20 minutes became 20 seconds. The doors burst open and Japanese soldiers flooded into the hospital. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat as rifle barrels swung toward them. A young private named Sarah Kowalski dropped the medical supplies she was carrying, the glass vials shattering on the tile floor. The girl was only 22, a radio operator who had been reassigned to the hospital when her unit was overrun on Wake Island. Her face had gone white as paper. The soldiers shouted commands in Japanese. None of the nurses understood. Then one officer stepped forward, speaking broken English with a thick accent that made each word sound like a threat. "You are prisoners of Imperial Japanese Army. You will obey. Any resistance will be met with immediate execution." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You are no longer soldiers. You are no longer anything. You belong to the Emperor now." Emily felt her stomach drop. She had heard stories about what happened to prisoners of war in Japanese custody, stories she had desperately hoped were exaggerated. Stories about the Bataan Death March, about summary executions, about camps where prisoners died by the thousands from disease and starvation. She looked at Maggie, searching for guidance, for hope, for anything. Maggie's face was set in grim determination. She squeezed Emily's hand once, hard, then stepped forward. "We are medical personnel protected under the Geneva Convention," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the rifles pointed at her chest. "We have wounded patients who require immediate care." The officer laughed, a sound without humor. "Geneva Convention means nothing here. You are in Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere now. Japanese law applies. Only Japanese law." They were marched through the burning streets of Manila. Hundreds of women, nurses, teachers, missionaries, civilian volunteers, anyone the Japanese had captured during their sweep through the Philippines. The city Emily had come to love was unrecognizable. Buildings burned unchecked. Bodies lay in the streets where they had fallen. Civilians watched from shuttered windows, their faces masks of terror and grief. Sister Agnes Murphy, a 45-year-old Irish nun who had spent 20 years running a medical mission in Manila, walked beside Emily. The older woman's lips moved in silent prayer, her rosary beads clutched tight in her weathered hands. She had refused to evacuate when the Japanese invaded, insisting that her patients needed her. Now she would pay for that loyalty with years of imprisonment. The march took 6 hours. 6 hours under the brutal tropical sun, with no water, no rest, no mercy. Women collapsed from heat exhaustion and were beaten until they stood again. An older teacher, Mrs. Harrison, fell and could not get up. Emily moved to help her, but a soldier shoved her back with his rifle. She was forced to watch as they dragged Mrs. Harrison to the side of the road. A single gunshot echoed. No one looked back. The camp was located 30 miles north of the city, a former agricultural facility surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. As they passed through the gates, Emily saw the words painted in Japanese characters above the entrance. Corporal Ruth Goldstein, a 26-year-old translator who had studied some Japanese at university before the war, whispered the translation. Cleanliness is next to divinity. Emily did not understand the significance then. She would soon learn. The commandant was waiting for them in the central courtyard. Colonel Yamamoto stood on a raised platform, his uniform immaculate despite the heat, his face carved from stone. At 48, he was a career military officer who had served in China and Manchuria before being assigned to the Philippines. He looked at the assembled prisoners with undisguised contempt. "You are here because you have contaminated yourselves by opposing the divine will of the emperor," he announced through an interpreter. "You have lived in corruption and decadence. You have forgotten the meaning of purity and discipline. Here you will learn. Here you will be corrected. Or you will die. The choice is yours." The first months were brutal, but survivable. They slept on wooden platforms in overcrowded barracks, 40 women packed into spaces designed for 20. Food was scarce, usually a thin rice gruel served twice a day with occasional vegetables that were often rotten. Disease spread quickly in the unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, malaria, beriberi, dengue fever. The list grew longer every week. Maggie organized the nurses into medical teams, doing what they could with almost no supplies. They made bandages from torn clothing. They boiled water to sterilize instruments. They held dying women in their arms and whispered comfort when there was no medicine left to give. Emily watched women die from simple infections that would have been easily treated outside the wire. Each death felt like a personal failure, but they survived. They formed bonds stronger than family. They created a community within the horror, a network of support and resistance that kept them human when the camp tried to reduce them to numbers. Sarah, the young radio operator, attached herself to Emily like a younger sister. The girl had nightmares every night, waking up screaming about the battle on Wake Island where most of her unit had been killed. Emily would hold her until the shaking stopped, whispering reassurances she did not truly believe herself. Sarah talked sometimes about her life before the war. She had grown up in Chicago, the daughter of Polish immigrants who ran a small bakery. She had enlisted to see the world, to escape the predictable path of marriage and children that seemed to be her only option. Her mother had cried for days when she left. Her father had given her his St. Christopher medal and made her promise to come home. That medal was long gone now, confiscated when they were captured, but Sarah still reached for it in her sleep. The guards were a constant presence. They watched everything, looking for any sign of defiance or resistance. Punishments were swift and brutal. A woman caught stealing food would be beaten in front of the entire camp. A woman caught trying to escape would simply disappear. They learned quickly to keep their heads down, to obey without question, to become invisible. Sergeant Akiko Tanaka was one of the few female guards, a stern 35-year-old woman who seemed to take her duties with religious seriousness. She rarely spoke to the prisoners except to bark orders, her face an unreadable mask. But Emily sometimes caught her watching them with something that might have been sympathy, before she quickly looked away. Once, when Emily collapsed from heat stroke during a work detail, Tanaka had allowed her to rest in the shade for 5 minutes before anyone else noticed. It was a small mercy, but in the camp small mercies meant everything. Tanaka had her own story, though the prisoners would not learn it until much later. She had been a teacher before the war, educated and cultured, with dreams of studying literature in Tokyo, but her family had fallen on hard times, and she had joined the military out of economic necessity. She believed in duty and honor, in the values she had been taught since childhood. But the longer she worked in the camp, the more she questioned whether what they were doing had anything to do with honor. Colonel Yamamoto commanded the camp with absolute authority. He gave speeches to the prisoners about the superiority of Japanese culture, about purity and contamination, about how American women had been corrupted by their decadent society. He spoke about Bushido, the way of the warrior, and how the weak deserved no mercy. He quoted ancient texts and military doctrine, constructing an elaborate justification for cruelty. Emily learned to keep her eyes down during these speeches. Any sign of defiance could result in punishment. She watched the colonel carefully, trying to understand the mind that could inflict such suffering while genuinely believing it was righteous. He was not a sadist who enjoyed causing pain. He was something perhaps more dangerous, a true believer who thought he was performing a sacred duty. The years ground on with terrible sameness. 1942 became 1943. The heat and hunger and disease continued. Women died and were buried in unmarked graves outside the camp. New prisoners arrived occasionally, bringing news from the outside world that was always weeks or months old. The war continued. The Japanese were winning. Then they were losing. Then no one knew for sure. 1943 became 1944. The food rations decreased. The guards became more nervous and more brutal. Rumors spread that the Japanese were losing ground across the Pacific, that American forces were island-hopping their way toward Japan itself. But the prisoners had learned not to hope too much. Hope was dangerous. Hope could break you worse than any physical punishment. Emily changed during those years. The idealistic young nurse who had volunteered for adventure died slowly, replaced by someone harder and more pragmatic. She learned to steal food without getting caught. She learned to treat wounds with nothing but dirty water and determination. She learned to disconnect emotionally from the suffering around her because feeling too much would drive her insane. But she never learned to stop caring entirely. That stubborn core of humanity remained, battered but unbroken. Maggie became the unofficial leader of the prisoners. She settled disputes, organized work details, made impossible decisions about who got the last of their medical supplies. She carried the weight of hundreds of lives on her shoulders and never complained. Emily watched her age 10 years in the span of 3, watched the silver spread through her black hair and the lines deepen around her eyes. But Maggie never wavered. She was their rock, their mother, their commander. Sister Agnes provided spiritual support to anyone who wanted it, regardless of their faith. She held prayer services in the barracks, her voice rising in Latin hymns that reminded them of a world beyond the wire. She heard confessions and offered absolution. She sat with the dying and helped them find peace. Her faith never seemed to waver, even when Emily wanted to shake her and demand how she could still believe in a God who would allow such suffering. Ruth used her language skills to gather intelligence. She listened to the guards talking and pieced together information about the war's progress. She kept a secret diary, writing in tiny script on scraps of paper she hid in the barracks. She was determined that if she survived, the world would know what had happened here. Every death, every cruelty, every moment of resistance would be recorded. News from the outside world came in whispers and rumors. The guards seemed increasingly nervous as 1944 turned into 1945. Lieutenant Hiroshi Watanabe, a 29-year-old junior officer, sometimes left extra food near the barracks when he thought no one was watching. He never spoke to the prisoners directly, but his small acts of kindness did not go unnoticed. Emily wondered what his story was, what circumstances had brought him to this place, whether he struggled with the same questions of duty and conscience that seemed to plague Sergeant Tanaka. Then came August 1945. The atmosphere in the camp changed overnight. The guards were agitated, arguing among themselves in rapid Japanese that Ruth strained to understand. She caught fragments of conversation, something about a powerful bomb, cities destroyed, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, names that meant nothing to the prisoners but seemed to fill the guards with terror. The emperor considering surrender, the impossible becoming possible. Emily felt a dangerous flutter of hope. Could the war actually be ending? After 3.5 years of imprisonment, could freedom actually be within reach? She tried to suppress the feeling. Hope was dangerous. Hope could destroy you if it was disappointed. But the hope grew anyway, spreading through the camp like wildfire. The prisoners whispered to each other in the darkness. Maybe soon, maybe finally, maybe they would survive after all. But Colonel Yamamoto had other plans. On August 14th, he called an assembly. All prisoners were ordered to the central courtyard. Emily stood with Maggie and Sarah, their bodies pressed close together as hundreds of women gathered under the brutal afternoon sun. The colonel's face was twisted with an emotion Emily had never seen before. Not anger. Something closer to desperation, to rage, mixed with grief. Japan has been forced into a temporary ceasefire, he announced, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. The interpreter struggled to keep up with his rapid speech. The emperor, in his divine wisdom, has chosen to end hostilities to preserve the Japanese people. But before any prisoner can be released, before you can return to contaminate your own people with what you have learned here, you must undergo purification. Emily felt ice water flood her veins. Maggie's hand found hers and squeezed hard. What did he mean by purification? The colonel continued, his voice rising with fanatical intensity. You have lived among the enemy for years. You have been exposed to our culture, our sacred traditions, our ways. You carry this contamination within you. You will take it back to your countries and spread lies about the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This cannot be allowed. You must be cleansed. The ceremony, he explained, was based on ancient Shinto purification rituals. Water and salt to cleanse impurities. Ritual bathing to wash away contamination. But even as he described it in religious terms, Emily understood the truth. This was not about purification. This was about punishment. This was about one final act of cruelty before they had to let the prisoners go. This was about a man who could not accept defeat, trying to inflict one last humiliation on the women he had controlled for so long. They were divided into groups of 20. Emily, Maggie, Sarah, Sister Agnes, and Ruth were in the first group. Sergeant Tanaka led them to a building they had never been allowed to enter before. Her face was carefully blank, but Emily thought she saw something in the woman's eyes. Shame? Regret? It was hard to tell. Inside, the air was thick with steam and the smell of harsh chemical soap. Large wooden tubs filled with scalding water lined the walls. Japanese characters were painted everywhere on the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. Ruth translated quietly. Purification, cleansing, redemption through suffering, purity of body and spirit. Contamination must be removed. On and on. The same themes repeated endlessly. Strip, Sergeant Tanaka ordered, her voice flat and emotionless. All clothing must be removed. All possessions must be surrendered. You will enter the purification completely bare. The women looked at each other in horror. Sister Agnes began to protest, her voice rising. This is barbaric. This violates every principle of human dignity. We are not animals to be. Tanaka cut her off. This is not negotiable. You will comply or you will be forced to comply. Emily's hands trembled as she began to unbutton her filthy prison uniform. The fabric was more holes than cloth after 3 years of wear, patched and repatched until it barely held together. Around her, the other women did the same, tears streaming down their faces. The humiliation was deliberate. They were being stripped of everything, reduced to nothing, made vulnerable in the most fundamental way possible. The guards watched. That was part of the ritual too, part of the humiliation. Male guards stood at attention around the room, their faces impassive as the women undressed. Emily tried to cover herself with her hands, but there was nowhere to hide. She felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical nakedness. This was about power, about control, about making them feel small and helpless. They were forced to stand naked while guards inspected them, checking for any items they might have hidden. Rough hands poked and prodded. Sarah was sobbing openly now. Maggie stood straight-backed and defiant, refusing to show weakness even as tears ran down her face. Sister Agnes continued to pray, her voice steady even as her body shook. Ruth's jaw was clenched so tight Emily thought her teeth might crack. Then came the water. The temperature was deliberately set to be almost unbearably hot. Emily gasped as she was pushed into the first tub, her skin immediately turning bright red. The heat was shocking, painful, like being boiled alive. She tried to climb out, but a guard forced her back down. You will remain until the contamination is removed, he said through the interpreter. The soap they were given was industrial strength, designed to strip away every trace of oil and dirt from skin. It burned like acid, especially on the cuts and sores that covered their bodies from years of malnutrition and poor hygiene. Emily scrubbed mechanically, following orders, trying to disconnect her mind from what was happening to her body. But there was no escape. The pain was too immediate, too overwhelming. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological torture. As they scrubbed, Japanese propaganda was broadcast through loudspeakers mounted in the corners of the room. Messages about contamination and impurity, about how they had been corrupted by their exposure to Japanese culture and needed to be cleansed before they could return home. The voices were calm, almost soothing, which made the message even more disturbing. "You have lived among a superior civilization," the voice intoned. "You have witnessed the glory of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. You have seen how the weak are corrected and the strong prevail. This knowledge contaminates you. You will carry it back to your decadent nations and spread confusion and lies. Therefore, you must be purified. The contamination must be burned away. Only then can you be released." The ritual was designed to break them, to make them feel dirty and ashamed, to make them internalize the idea that they were somehow impure and needed to be cleansed. It was psychological warfare of the most insidious kind. Emily felt the message worming into her brain despite her resistance. Part of her, the exhausted, traumatized part that had endured 3 years of imprisonment, wanted to believe it, wanted to accept that there was something wrong with her that needed to be fixed. Emily watched Sarah collapse in the water, sobbing uncontrollably. The young woman had endured 3 years of imprisonment with remarkable strength, but this final violation shattered something inside her. Maggie pulled Sarah from the tub, holding her despite the guards shouting at them to continue the process. "I have got you," Maggie whispered fiercely. "We are almost through this. Just hold on a little longer. Do not let them win. Do not let them break you now." But Sarah was beyond hearing. She had retreated somewhere deep inside herself, somewhere the guards could not reach. Her eyes were open but unfocused. Her body shook with silent sobs. Emily recognized the signs of complete psychological collapse. She had seen it before in the camp, in women who had simply given up, who had decided that death was preferable to one more day of suffering. Sister Agnes prayed throughout the entire ordeal, her voice rising above the propaganda in defiant Latin. "Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Hail Mary, full of grace. The Lord is with thee." Some of the other women joined her, their voices creating a counter-melody to the hatred pouring from the speakers. Emily found strength in that sound, in the reminder that they were still human, still together, still unbroken in the ways that truly mattered. The ceremony lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of scalding water, harsh soap, and psychological assault. They were moved from tub to tub, each one hotter than the last, each one accompanied by new messages about contamination and purification. Guards scrubbed them with rough brushes when they were deemed not to be cleaning themselves adequately. The brushes tore at their skin, leaving raw, bleeding patches. When it was finally over, they were given rough cotton garments to wear and led back to the barracks. Emily's skin was raw and burning. Her body ached. But worse than the physical pain was the look she saw in the eyes of the women waiting for their turn. Pure terror. They had heard the screams. They knew what was coming, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Sergeant Tanaka lingered after the other guards left. For the first time in 3 years, she spoke directly to the prisoners in halting English. "I am sorry. This is wrong, but I must follow orders. If I refuse, they will kill me and find someone else to do this work. I am sorry." Then she was gone, leaving them to process what had just happened. Emily sat on her wooden platform, staring at her reddened hands. The skin was peeling in places, raw and tender, but the physical damage would heal. She was more worried about the psychological wounds. She felt violated in a way that had nothing to do with physical injury. The ceremony had been designed to make them feel contaminated, to make them internalize the idea that they were somehow impure, somehow deserving of this treatment. But Maggie would not let that poison take root. She stood in the center of the barracks, her voice strong despite her exhaustion and pain. "Listen to me. All of you, listen. What they did to us was evil. It was not purification. It was cruelty dressed up in ritual and religion. We are not contaminated. We are not impure. We are survivors. We have endured 3 years of hell and we are still here. We are still standing, and we will walk out of here with our heads high." Emily felt tears streaming down her face. Around the barracks, other women were nodding, drawing strength from Maggie's words. Sister Agnes added her voice. "They tried to break our spirits, but they failed. They tried to make us feel less than human, but we refused. We held on to our humanity even when they tried to strip it away. That is our victory. That is what they can never take from us. The purification ceremonies continued for 3 days. Every woman in the camp was forced to endure the ritual. Some groups faced even worse treatment. There were reports of beatings, of women being held underwater until they nearly drowned, of guards who took the opportunity to inflict additional humiliations beyond what the ceremony required. Colonel Yamamoto oversaw it all with the fervor of a true believer, convinced he was performing a sacred duty. On the second day, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson died during the ceremony. Her heart simply gave out from the stress and the heat. The guards dragged her body out and continued with the next woman as if nothing had happened. Emily heard about it from another prisoner and felt rage burn through her grief. Mrs. Patterson had been a teacher, a kind woman who had volunteered to educate Filipino children before the war. She had survived 3 years of imprisonment, only to die in this final act of cruelty. But on the 4th day, everything changed. American forces arrived. Emily heard the trucks before she saw them. The sound of English being shouted outside the gates. American accents. The most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The guard suddenly disappeared, melting away into the jungle rather than face capture. Colonel Yamamoto was found in his office, having committed ritual suicide rather than surrender. He left a note claiming he had fulfilled his duty to the emperor and could now die with honor. Sergeant Tanaka did not run. She stood in the center of the camp as American soldiers poured through the gates, her face calm and resigned. She was arrested immediately and would later testify about the conditions in the camp, about the purification ceremonies, about everything she had witnessed. Her testimony would be crucial in documenting what had happened, though many would dismiss it as exaggeration or propaganda. Lieutenant Watanabe opened the gates himself. His face was streaked with tears as he bowed deeply to the prisoners. "I am sorry. I am so sorry for what was done to you. I tried to help when I could, but it was not enough. It will never be enough. Please forgive me." Then he stepped aside and let them walk free. Emily took her first steps outside the camp with Maggie on one side and Sarah on the other. Sarah was still barely responsive, her eyes vacant, her movements mechanical. But she was walking. She was alive. That had to be enough for now. Sister Agnes was singing a hymn of thanksgiving. Her voice cracked, but joyful. Ruth was laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by emotions she had suppressed for years. American soldiers wrapped them in blankets and loaded them onto trucks. A young medic, he could not have been more than 20, looked at Emily's burned skin with horror. "Ma'am, what did they do to you?" His voice cracked on the question. Emily tried to find the words to explain, but they would not come. How could she describe the purification ceremony to someone who had not experienced it? How could she make him understand that the physical wounds would heal, but the psychological scars would last forever? They were taken to a field hospital where proper medical care awaited. Real beds with clean sheets, hot food that was not rice gruel, medicine and bandages, and doctors who treated them with gentleness and respect. It felt surreal, like a dream Emily was afraid to believe in case she woke up back in the camp. Maggie immediately went to work helping treat the other survivors, unable to simply rest while others needed her skills. She moved from bed to bed, checking wounds, offering comfort, doing what she had done for 3 years but now with actual supplies and support. Emily watched her and felt a surge of love and admiration. Maggie had kept them alive through sheer force of will. She deserved to rest, to be taken care of, but that was not who she was. Sarah clung to Emily for hours, terrified that if she let go, she would wake up back in the camp. She did not speak, just held on with desperate strength. Emily held her back and whispered reassurances. "You are safe now. It is over. We made it. We survived." But she knew the words were only partially true. The physical imprisonment was over, but the psychological prison would take much longer to escape. Sister Agnes organized prayer services for those who found comfort in faith. She led them in thanksgiving, in grief for those who had not survived, in hope for the future. Emily attended, even though her own faith had been badly shaken. She found comfort not in the prayers themselves, but in the community, in being surrounded by women who understood what she had endured. Ruth began documenting everything, determined that the world would know what had happened. She interviewed survivors, collected testimonies, wrote down every detail she could remember. She was obsessive about it, working late into the night until exhaustion forced her to stop. Emily understood. Ruth needed this. She needed to transform their suffering into something concrete, something that could not be denied or forgotten. In the following weeks, Emily learned the full scope of what had occurred. The purification ceremonies had not been limited to their camp. Across the Pacific, in dozens of Japanese prison camps, similar rituals had been performed on female prisoners before surrender. Thousands of women had been subjected to these final acts of cruelty, but the ceremonies were rarely discussed in official reports. The focus was on physical atrocities, on death marches and executions and torture. The psychological torture of the purification rituals was footnoted or ignored entirely. Some military officials seemed uncomfortable with the sexual nature of the humiliation and tried to minimize it in their reports. Others dismissed the women's accounts as exaggeration or hysteria. The word of traumatized female prisoners carried less weight than it should have. Emily struggled with what to do with her story. Part of her wanted to forget, to bury the memories deep and never speak of them again. She wanted to go home to Boston, to see her parents, to try to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. But another part, the part that had become a nurse because she wanted to help people, knew that silence would be a betrayal. These women deserved to have their suffering acknowledged. The world needed to know what had been done in the name of purity and honor. She began giving testimony to military investigators. She described the ceremony in clinical detail, watching their faces grow pale as they understood the full horror of what she was describing. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. How could such things happen? Surely she was confused, traumatized, misremembering. Others seemed uncomfortable with the sexual nature of the humiliation and tried to minimize it in their reports. It was just bathing, one investigator said. Unpleasant, certainly, but not torture. Emily wanted to scream at him. She wanted to grab him by the collar and make him understand, but she kept her voice calm and professional. It was torture. It was designed to humiliate and dehumanize us. It was a final act of cruelty inflicted on women who had already endured years of imprisonment. That matters. That needs to be recorded. But she could see in his eyes that he did not truly understand. He could not. He had not been there. Maggie stood beside her, adding her own testimony. Sarah found the courage to speak despite her trauma, though she broke down several times during her interview. Sister Agnes wrote detailed accounts for church officials, determined that the Catholic Church would know what had been done to women under their protection. Ruth compiled everything into a comprehensive document that she hoped would be included in the official record of the war. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal heard some of this testimony. Sergeant Tanaka was called as a witness. She confirmed everything the survivors had said, her voice steady as she described her role in the ceremonies. She expressed remorse but did not make excuses. I followed orders. That does not absolve me of responsibility. I knew what we were doing was wrong, but I did it anyway. I must live with that for the rest of my life. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a punishment that seemed inadequate to Emily, but was more than many war criminals received. Colonel Yamamoto escaped justice through suicide. Lieutenant Watanabe was never charged, his small acts of kindness apparently earning him leniency. Emily did not know how to feel about that. He had helped when he could, but he had also been complicit in their imprisonment. The survivors scattered across the world, returning to homes that no longer felt like home, to families who could not understand what they had endured. Emily went back to Boston. Her mother cried when she saw her, horrified by how thin and scarred she had become. Her father hugged her carefully, as if she might break. They asked questions at first, but stopped when they saw how Emily struggled to answer. Some things were too painful to speak about. Emily tried to return to normal life, but normal no longer existed. She could not sleep without nightmares. She could not tolerate small enclosed spaces. She flinched at loud noises. She found herself counting exits wherever she went, always planning escape routes. The war was over, but her body had not gotten the message. She was still in survival mode, still waiting for the next threat. Years later, Emily would return to nursing. She specialized in trauma care, working with veterans and survivors of violence. She understood their struggles in a way few others could. She knew about nightmares and flashbacks, about the way trauma could ambush you years after the original event. She married a doctor she met at the VA hospital, a kind man who understood when she woke up screaming from nightmares. He had his own demons from the war. They helped each other carry the weight. She never had children, feeling that she had given all her maternal energy to caring for patients. But she stayed in touch with the other survivors. They were her family in ways her blood relatives could never be. They understood. They had been there. They carried the same scars. Maggie became a psychiatrist, pioneering treatments for what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. She worked with returning veterans, with survivors of violence, with anyone struggling to rebuild their lives after trauma. Her research was groundbreaking, helping to establish PTSD as a legitimate medical condition rather than weakness or cowardice. She never married, dedicating her life entirely to her work. Sarah struggled for decades with anxiety and depression. She had multiple hospitalizations, periods where the trauma overwhelmed her completely, but she eventually found peace working as an advocate for POW rights. She testified before Congress, pushing for better support for former prisoners. She wrote a memoir that became a bestseller, finally giving voice to experiences that had been ignored for too long. Sister Agnes returned to missionary work, spending her remaining years serving the poor in Southeast Asia. She went back to the Philippines, to the very country where she had been imprisoned, and rebuilt her medical mission. When people asked why she would return to the place of her trauma, she said simply that the people there needed help and she could provide it. The past was past. The work was what mattered. Ruth became a historian, ensuring that the stories of female POWs were included in the official record. She fought against the tendency to minimize or ignore women's experiences in war. She published books and articles, gave lectures, trained new historians. She was relentless in her mission to make sure these stories were not forgotten. They gathered every year on the anniversary of their liberation. The group grew smaller as time passed, as age and illness claimed them one by one. But they never forgot. They never stopped telling their stories to anyone who would listen, because the purification ceremonies were not just about what happened to them. They were about how societies use concepts of purity and contamination to justify cruelty, about how ritual can be twisted to serve evil purposes, about how important it is to remember even the most uncomfortable parts of history. Emily lived to be 93 years old. In her final interview, recorded just weeks before her death, she was asked what she wanted people to understand about the purification ceremonies. She thought for a long moment, her aged hands folded in her lap, the same hands that had been burned raw all those years ago, before answering. They tried to make us feel dirty. They tried to make us feel like we needed to be cleansed of some contamination, but we were never dirty. We were prisoners of war who survived impossible circumstances with our humanity intact. The only contamination was the hatred and cruelty in the hearts of those who designed those ceremonies. Remember that. Remember us. But also remember that we survived. We healed. We lived full lives despite what was done to us. That is the real story. Not the cruelty, but the resilience. Not the trauma, but the recovery. Not the breaking, but the refusal to stay broken. The purification ceremonies remain one of the least known aspects of the Pacific War. They are rarely mentioned in history books or documentaries. When female POW experiences are discussed at all, the focus is usually on the more straightforward physical hardships of imprisonment, the psychological torture, the sexual humiliation, the deliberate attempts to break women's spirits. These are often glossed over or ignored entirely, but the women who endured them never forgot. Their testimonies exist in archives and oral histories, in memoirs and interviews waiting for anyone willing to listen. Because these stories matter, they remind us that war's cruelties extend far beyond the battlefield. They show us that psychological torture can be as damaging as physical violence. They demonstrate that the human capacity for resilience is stronger than any attempt to break it. They also remind us to be skeptical of anyone who uses concepts of purity and contamination to justify cruelty. The language of cleansing and purification has been used throughout history to dehumanize and harm. The Japanese military used it to justify the purification ceremonies. The Nazis used it to justify the Holocaust. Countless other regimes have used similar rhetoric to justify atrocities. When we hear that language today, we should recognize it for what it is: a dangerous attempt to dress up cruelty in the clothing of righteousness. The survivors wanted their stories told not for sympathy or pity, but for education and prevention. They wanted future generations to understand what had been done to them so that similar atrocities might be prevented. They wanted people to recognize the warning signs of systematic dehumanization. They wanted their suffering to mean something, to serve some purpose beyond the pain itself. Emily, Maggie, Sarah, Sister Agnes, Ruth, and thousands of other women endured the purification ceremonies and survived to tell about it. Their resilience in the face of deliberate cruelty is a testament to human strength. Their willingness to speak about their experiences despite social pressure to remain silent is a testament to human courage. Their insistence that these stories be remembered and learned from is a testament to human wisdom. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel to learn more untold stories from history. Hit the like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how we can ensure these stories are never forgotten. These women deserved better than to have their suffering ignored or minimized. The least we can do is remember them, honor their experiences, and learn from what they endured. Thank you for watching and for bearing witness to this difficult but important history.